fireworks were thrown from a moving car into a crowd of demonstrators outside a police station near Yuen Long. Violence on the streets of Hong Kong, a society that's become incredibly polarised. Things are very unpredictable. In fact, Hong Kong's been hit by a typhoon, and yet some protesters were still out during that. But it is a good moment to ask how the protests and the heavy-handed response is being covered in local media. So earlier I spoke to Tom Grundy, founder and editor-in-chief of something called the Hong Kong Free Press.
Unfortunately, lots of journalism watchdogs over recent years, the last 10 years, I'd say, have been charting the decline of press freedom in Hong Kong, whether it be commercial boycotts or ownership issues. Many of the newspapers ultimately owned or controlled by Beijing or people with business interests in the mainland. There's the issue of self-censorship, attacks on journalists and these kinds of things. And certainly, even today, we've seen a statement by the Foreign Correspondents Club concerned about attacks by police upon journalists just in the last couple of days. But as far as Asia's concerned, it's still considered somewhat of a bastion of press freedom in the region, as much as it has been under fire in recent years.
Right, so in terms of newspapers, and newspapers that are commonly read in Cantonese rather than in English, what are they basically supporting the Chinese side of this, or are they supporting the protesters? Where would you say the average newspaper editorial is?
They will mostly be more conservative or pro-Beijing, if only because they are generally outright owned by the Communist Party, like the Wen Waipo or the Ta Kung Pao, or they have owners that have business interests in the mainland. And that tends to reflect how their coverage is. I mean, you can take any of the recent protests and you'll either find that things are buried or they're not mentioned at all. There's something for everyone if there are clashes, as there were over the weekend. The pro-Beijing press and side will show protesters misbehaving and emphasize that and splash that all over the front page, whereas the more pro-democracy press will show the police misbehaving. You have some of the more neutral titles like the Ming Pao, which is probably the newspaper of note, of merit in Hong Kong, and then the South China Morning Post is the big English newspaper that's ultimately owned by Alibaba and a Communist Party member, Jack Ma. But I'd say its reporting has been pretty fair on the ground, right, although some of their print edition sort of editorials and their opinion pieces have been a lot more conservative.
But there must be some, apart from social media, which is obviously where a lot of this happens, there must be some solid pro-democracy voices then, because there's enough freedom for that, surely.
Certainly the one remaining big pro-democracy voice is the tabloid The Apple Daily. I mean, you see their posters and their umbrellas everywhere during these protests. They suffer a lot in terms of when it comes to their press freedom and receiving death threats or pickets at the editor's residence. So they're just going behind a paywall, in fact. So they're launching membership because it's a struggle for them to get advertising. Nobody wants to upset their business in the mainland.
What about TV? You know, in Britain, there's quite an adversarial television and radio culture of politicians being given a tough time. That undeferential approach, I don't think, is the culture in Hong Kong.
Yeah, things are a bit more traditional here. It's not like you have any sort of Fox News going on. Certainly in the last few weeks, we've seen some very robust lines of questioning from a certain Nabella Kosher, who is a RTHK reporter, and that's the public broadcast here, the equivalent of the BBC, although it's solely funded by the government. And she really did lay into the leader, Carrie Lam, a couple of weeks ago with question after question. And that probably speaks volumes about the fact that RTHK is considered the most credible and is very independent despite its government funding. But otherwise, the government is pretty absent. They are doing maybe a press conference every 1 or 2 weeks. So we're not really having those opportunities to question officials over this.
Tom Grundy of the Hong Kong Free Press.